Poetry is playing with the language or playing with words, done to kind of see what we kind of create out of words and language and the design that we can create out of language. In this way, it's kind of marked from ordinary conversation or language that we ordinarily use to communicate back and forth in some way. The traditional way of doing so is through the use of rhyme and meter to create what we typically would call verse. And what I want to do today is kind of create a quick primer for how we go about determining things like rhyme schemes, different types of meter, and the terminology or language that we use to speak of these different things. I want to begin by talking about stanzas, which are groupings of lines. This is somewhat similar to paragraphs in normal writing, but stanzas can take on different kinds of functions than paragraphs do. But we have some different terms that we use for different groupings of lines. A two-line grouping is a couplet, a three-line grouping is a tercet, a four-line grouping a quatrain, a five-line group is a quintain or a quintet, a six-line grouping is a sestet, an eight-line group is an octave. And so it's just kind of knowing the terminology we use to speak of these different groups of lines. Often these are kind of determined mostly by the white space you'll see on the page between these different groupings, but they can also be determined by the rhyme scheme that we find within certain poems, particularly when there's big blocks of text. For example, when it comes to a sonnet, which is a 14-line poem, these are often broken down between an octave and a sestet in traditional Italian sonnets, or in the English sonnet with three quatrains and a couplet at the end. And again, this is determined by the kind of rhyme scheme that we do find within these poems. When it comes to thinking about rhyme schemes, we're usually talking about end rhyme, or the rhymes that happen at the ends of lines. And these have been done traditionally throughout history as a mnemonic device, as one way of helping us to remember the lines of verse as they do kind of go, as people would kind of recite these by memory. We have kind of a lettering system that we use for helping to determine rhyme scheme. That's mainly just to help us point out the different rhymes to kind of see them a little bit more easily. I'm using as an example Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken. As you can see, this is kind of divided into 4 5-line stanzas or 5 quintains or quintets. Four quintains or quintets. And if we kind of look at the rhyme scheme that we have in here, we kind of start by looking at the rhyming sounds at the ends of these lines. And the first rhyming sound that we have is the word would. We just kind of assign that the letter A to kind of note that rhyme sound. The next line ends with the word both, which sounds different than would, so we just kind of give that a letter B for a different rhyming sound. Line 3 is the word stood. Stood sounds like would, so we give that another A. Line 4 we have could stood, would, that's another A. And then lastly we have undergrowth. Growth rhymes with both, so that's rhyming word B that we do have. We move to the next stanza. We have fair, which is different from could and growth, so that would be rhyme C. Then we have claim, which is again a new rhyme, that would be rhyme D. Then we go back to where, fair, there, where, fair, and then same, and claim. There we go. And so we do have, as we start to see a pattern emerging here, that the letters kind of help us see. We've got kind of this A, B, A, B, C, D, C, C, D. And then as we go through the poem, we see how this kind of continues. We have lay, then we have black, which is a new rhyme F, day, which goes back to rhymes E, way, day, lay, which is rhyme E, and then back, which is black, which is F. And indeed, we see this pattern kind of developing all throughout the poem. And again, the letters that we use kind of just help us see this a little bit more clearly. We have A, B, C, D, C, C, D, E, F, E, E, F, which means that we don't necessarily have any of these rhymes working all the way through the poem, but each of these stanzas, lines 1, 3, and 4 rhyme, and lines 2 and 5 are going to rhyme. And this is a pattern that Frost is kind of imposing upon this poem. Again, one way that he's kind of playing with language or designing language in some way. Something else I just wanted to point out while I've got Frost's poem up has to do with the way we read poetry, and it ties in a little bit with the rhythm of poems as well. And it has to do with end-stopped lines versus end-jammed lines. And just to give you a few terms here that I'm going to talk about, end-stop lines, which are lines where when we read them, come to kind of a natural pause at the ends of those lines, and usually where a full thought ends at the very end of a line. Enjambment happens when one line kind of runs right into the next line without a real pause at the end of that line, or a natural pause that would occur there, because the natural speech or the thought kind of continues onto the next line. And then a caesura versus a pause being at the end of a line, a caesura is a pause that happens in the middle of a line. And we can kind of see this in the very first stanza of The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in yellow wood, and so I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Now, a lot of these lines kind of are end-stop lines, particularly the first one, two roads diverged in yellow wood. We have kind of a full thought, a comma that happens there, and so we kind of pause naturally at the end of that line. But the next line doesn't quite end at the very end. And so I could not travel both and be one traveler. That full thought really continues from one line onto the next, and that's what a enjambment is how that one line kind of enjambs itself into the next one. And indeed, the pause we have, this caesura here in the middle of the line rather than at the end. And then the rest of these kind of are really end stop. Long I stood, looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. While there is still kind of continuation of that thought, there is at least some kind of pause or end of the ideas when we do come to those. But that's one of the things to kind of keep in mind when you are reading poetry, is that you're not just reading individual lines, but making sure that you're reading full thoughts as you're moving through. That these two roads diverged in the yellow wood, okay, and then so I could not travel both and be one traveler, okay, that's a full thought I need to know. So long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Making sure that we're seeing those full ideas as we're reading to make sure that we don't get any misreadings as we're moving forward. Next, I wanted to kind of quickly note how we go about determining rhythmical patterns in English verse. Most English verse uses what we call an accentual syllabic form of meter. What that means is that we look at both the syllables that appear within lines, but also where the more stressed syllables are as well, where accents kind of fall. And a rhythm is kind of determined between those lesser stressed syllables and the more stronger stressed syllables. And we determine this by doing what we call scanning lines, which is kind of going through a poem and determining where the less stressed syllables are and the more stressed syllables are. We typically give the less stressed syllables this little U-like symbol that we have here, and then the more stressed syllables we usually put a little accent mark over, like we would normally with syllables and words. And we kind of read through the lines and determine patterns that maybe develop between these less stressed and more strongly stressed syllables. And the example here that I have is Amazing Grace, and certainly if you know the music that goes with this, you can kind of hear and feel the beat that goes with it. But just to read through this: Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. And you can kind of hear where the more strongly stressed syllables would naturally fall within these lines. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. And so we do kind of see this pattern develop in this way. We usually kind of use these little lines to help we find these patterns, that we kind of have an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. And we can kind of see that this rhythmic pattern develops and does indeed work its way through this whole example. The next example I want to kind of show you, another kind of popular poem, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," and this kind of has a little different feel to it when we do read through it. And again, as we do read through, we kind of listen for, again, those more strongly stressed syllables. "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. All the stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in the hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there." And here we have like a triplet feel that develops where we have kind of two unstressed syllables that's followed by a more strongly stressed syllable. "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. All the stockings were hung by the chimney with care in the hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. And so here again, we can kind of see a pattern emerge. And again, we kind of use the little slashes that we put between these lines to kind of see, here's a little unit, here's a unit. We can kind of see the regularity kind of between these develop. Now, these units that we do see kind of developing, these little patterns that we see, are referred to as feet or metrical feet, and that's just another kind of term to be aware of. And we do have some different terms for the different kinds of patterns of different metrical feet that we see. A trochee is a foot where it's a stress symbol with an unstressed symbol. An iamb is a foot that's an unstressed symbol followed by a stress symbol. A dactyl is a triplet meter that's got the stress and then two unstresses following. The anapest is two unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable. A spondee is kind of a variation on the pattern where there's kind of two stressed syllables that kind of happen together, and then the pyrrhic foot is kind of another kind of lesser known or lesser seen kind of variation where there's two unstressed syllables that kind of happen together within one of these feet. And then we also measure the length of these metrical lines by how many of these feet or how many of these patterns we see in them. Line of poetry that is just kind of one metrical foot would be a monometer, or 1 foot line. Dimeter would be a 2 foot line. Trimeter, a 3 foot line. Tetrameter, a 4 foot line. Pentameter, a 5 foot line. Hexameter, 6. Heptameter, 7. Octameter, 8. Hopefully you don't have lines that go longer than that. But again, this is just the terminology that we do have. So if we go back to our examples, we look at Amazing Grace. We've got this unstressed syllable followed by a stressed symbol is the pattern. And again, this is called an iamb, or we call this verse iambic because it's got mostly iambs to it. And then we find 4 of these within the line. So we would call this a line of iambic tetrameter. That's followed by a line of iambic trimeter. And indeed, what we kind of note in this poem is that we have varying lines of 4 beats and 3 beats, or 4 feet and 3 feet, as we work our way through it. And this is actually something we refer to as the ballad meter, or the ballad stanza that we would often find in poems. And this is what ballads typically fall into, are usually varying lines of 4 beats and 3 beats, with the rhymes usually at the ends of the second and fourth lines, is the ballad stanza, just another term to throw at you. Now in 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, we certainly have a different type of foot that we do see here. This is the anapest, which is again a kind of 3 syllable foot that's got 2 unstressed syllables and then a stressed syllable following it. We call this anapestic verse. And again, we have in each of these lines 1, 2, 3, 4 of these anapest feet. So it's anapestic tetrameter, which again means that it's anapestic verse feet, and that there's 4 of these in a line. One last thing to note is that verse isn't necessarily always going to be regular in its patterns, like we see in these examples, that often you'll be reading something that's largely iambic, but you'll find that there's a trochee put at the beginning of a line, or an anapest thrown in the middle, or a spondee that certainly erupts in the middle of a line. And that's okay. So long as it's largely iambic all the way throughout, we still refer to it as iambic verse, just with some variations. And indeed, most verse in English is written in iambs, and it's either iambic tetrameter or iambic pentameter is usually what we do find. And that's just one thing to kind of note. This isn't meant to be something for you to have to memorize, or it's not going to be tested on, but I do want you to be able to note how language is being ordered and patterned and designed in various ways, and how to determine some of these patterns, whether it's rhyme schemes or rhythmic kinds of patterns, so you can kind of see where there might be those variations and how those variations might lead to some kind of emphasis, or different things being stressed or things being pointed out in those kinds of ways. So that's just one thing to kind of think a little bit about here, is language being patterned and designed, stress and emphasis that we might see in the variations as you do move forward, to help you to read and understand poetry a little bit more better and clearly.